Greetings out there, rock and roll fans, and welcome to the 43rd edition of the Ugly American Werewolf in London Rock Podcast, recorded here just off Abbey Road in central London. I am your host, Mac B, the Wolf, and I gotta tell you, I'm really excited about this week's show. I will be joined, as always, by my partner in crime, Gary Action Not Words Jackson, and if you understand that reference, you probably have an idea of what we're going to be talking about today. But generally, if you know the show, you know that we're just two old college friends who love rock music, love classic rock, hard rock, heavy metal, old MTV, progressive rock, all the stuff that we're into, and we love all the little details, the minutia, the did you know facts about everything. And that's why today we're super excited to have a special guest on our show, and that's Neil from Def Lep Pod. Neil's been running the Def Leppard podcast for a little over a year and a half, I feel like, has a very nice following, and he has incredible knowledge about the band Def Leppard. Just intimate, tiny little details about the history of the band, the recordings, the songs themselves, and that's the kind of stuff that we love to get into here on The Wolf. So he's going to tell us a little bit about how he became a Def Leppard fan, and then he's going to provide us a little bit of perspective, like the difference between being a Def Leppard fan in the UK versus the US. Because in the US, they're kind of held high in the pantheon of hard rock and roll bands, but in the UK, I feel like they're underrated or underappreciated. Kind of like the reverse of Oasis in the UK versus the US. So we're going to dive deep into that. And you can check out his pod, Def Lep Pod, a Def Leppard podcast. And you can follow him on Twitter at Def Lep Pod. Of course, we want you to follow us and download us on Spotify or Apple or Google or Amazon or wherever you get your podcasts. You can see all past episodes at www.uglyamericanwerewolf.libsyn.com. And I want you to check us out on Twitter. I'm at ugly_werewolf and Jackson's at ActionJack72. We've been having a lot of fun on Twitter lately, and I got to see Steve Hackett here recently, and we've got some great Twitter shots of that show and some great likes and retweets going on there, so I hope you can check it out. But this week, we take a deep dive into Hysteria, the 1987 Def Leppard classic that yielded 7 singles in America and 6 top 20 mainstream Billboard 100 hits. When's the last time a rock band had 6 top 20 hits off one record? I think this is it, folks. I think this is the one. Maybe Metallica's Black Album, but I don't know if it's been done since then. And of course, it almost didn't happen thanks to the fact that their drummer Rick Allen was in a terrible accident and lost his left arm, which obviously put a damper on recordings and very much put his career in jeopardy. Of course, the story is the story of legend in that they came back, they stuck by him. He learned to play with both feet more and to use some technology to help make sure he could stay in the band. And the band put out an enormous record with huge hits like Hysteria, Animal, Love Bites, and of course the American big-time favorite, the American, you heard it coming out of IROC Z's all over America in the summer of 1988 and 1989 for that matter, Pour Some Sugar on Me. So if you're a child of the 80s, I think you're going to like this one. Neil is great. We had a lot of fun talking with him. It was like having pints with an old friend at the pub. So sit back, relax. We get the Ugly American Werewolf and Def Lep Pod doing Hysteria here on The Wolf. All right, so I can put on my DJ phone. Hey, welcome to the Ugly American Werewolf in London Rock Podcast. And we're joined here today by Neil from Def Lep Pod up in the Midland North Country. Hey, Neil, thanks for joining us.
No, thanks, Mac. I love that introduction.
No, I mean, it's great to have you on. It's great to have someone with so much knowledge of Def Leppard. I mean, I love the song Let It Go, but didn't know until I listened to your show that it was 132 beats per minute. It's like, now that's the kind of knowledge that I need to have. And the way you break down the tracks is brilliant. So I don't know if we're going to be able to stand up to that because we usually do an hour-long show on like a record, and you could do more than an hour on one song. But what we really want to hear is kind of how you got into Def Leppard and kind of give us the English perspective as a Def Lep fan, because I got a feeling it's just a little different than ours being Americans.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for inviting me on. Well, the first thing, the Let It Go and it being 128 beats per minute, that's not the type of knowledge that I have rattling around in my head. I might have actually looked that up. That might not truly be reflective of what's rattling around in my brain. Yeah, so in terms of my own experience of Def Leppard and being a Def Leppard fan, and when I got into them, it's been quite a solo pursuit. To be honest, I got into Def Leppard when I was 10 years old in 1988, simply because my brother, who's 3 years older, was into Iron Maiden, and he was into a band, and he had all the posters up on the wall. And obviously, you look up to your big brother in musical tastes, and I was very much, I'll get into Iron Maiden as well. Never heard them, but cool posters and everything. And he was like, well, that's good, but why don't you get your own band as well? And then I always remember he said to me, there's a band now called Def Leppard. I think they're pretty good. Why don't you get into them? So it was a really manufactured, conscious decision to get into a band that I'd never heard of. So I went to the shop and I bought the single that was out at the time, which was the Love Bite single of Hysteria, which obviously we're going to be talking about today. So this isn't like a big rock song. This isn't like a cool story of, someone being 14 and rebelling and getting into punk and, being at the first Sex Pistols gig. Right. This is a 10-year-old boy going to a shop called Woolworths and buying a ballad and a very romantic song, buying that, never even hearing the band. But luckily for me, it had Love Bites on it. It had the song Excitable, or an extended version of it, and the Orgasmic Mix it's called, right? Which is off Hysteria. And it also had Billy's Got a Gun live on it. So on that 112-inch record, there's 3 very, very different songs. So I was able straight away to get a taste of the variety. Def Leppard might not be a band that you think there's a lot of variety in. Someone with Def Leppard podcast will probably argue that there is. But there was that variety straight away. And I got lucky that I did actually like this music, and then it all started from then. But I'm 43 now. Yeah, the whole time, like for the last 30 years or so, none of my friends have been into Def Leppard. We've got the same musical taste in terms of rock and metal. But I was on my own in that one. And it's only really in the last year or so since I've started this, my own Def Leppard podcast, that I've been introduced to a community of Def Leppard fans, most of which are in the States, but I've found other versions of me in the UK as well, which has been great. So yeah, that's been my experience of Def Leppard so far.
Well, that's great. And for the most part, Jax and I, sometimes we have a little different views because I kind of grew up in the Midwest, the big bit in the middle. Sometimes the Brits will refer to it as, whereas Jackson grew up in greater New York City, the tri-state area, maybe, if you will. And so sometimes we have different experiences. But for the most part, we both came to Def Leppard the same way because we're about 5 years older than you. So we were 10 in 1983 when Photograph was huge all over MTV. And we did that on Show 9, Jackson. But, you want to tell them a little bit about how we found Def Leppard as younger kids?
Well, the way I found it was MTV. MTV was, in my parents' estimation, pretty close to looking into the devil's window. So I said, well, that's something I've got to check out. And yeah, they were all over MTV. They had Photograph was huge, Rock of Ages, Foolin'. They were all great rock tracks. Really cool videos, and I brought this up before, and I hate to admit it, but the coolest rock bands come from the UK. So they added another layer of being cool because they were British, and they had Joe Elliott had the cool Union Jack T-shirt on, which I thought was awesome. And they were just a really great straight ahead rock band at that point in time, but yet also were on Top 40 radio and MTV, and I just automatically it was attracted to that because it was right down. It was really what I was interested in, guitar-driven hard rock.
Yeah, everyone had a copy of Pyromania, and everybody had a copy of 1984 by Van Halen when we were like 10, 11, 12 years old. Like that was it.
It's really interesting, especially the Photograph reference, because Pyromania did nothing in the UK. And I know people may know about this, but essentially Def Leppard don't break in the UK until the summer of 1987, pretty much to the month, 10 years after they've formed. So they've had a little purple period right at the beginning when they're caught up in the hype of the new wave of British heavy metal. And they have quite a successful first tour, like theatre tour of the UK in 1980, which goes pretty well. But High and Dry does nothing. Pyromania does nothing. And that's the strangest one, because obviously Pyromania is huge in America. Yeah. And interestingly, with Photograph, which is obviously gets out of there because it becomes popular because of MTV, the radio is very different in America. We're in the UK. You really need to break the top 40. So it's not a Billboard 100, it's a top 40. And essentially, if you miss out on that top 40, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Where if you don't get into the top 40, you won't be played on the radio. And if you don't get played on the radio, no one will hear it, and therefore you won't climb the charts. Photograph in the UK got to number 41. So
you guys don't have like other formats, like you don't have like or you didn't back then have like classic rock and okay. So it was top 40 owned.
It's difficult to explain to people outside of the UK how backwards the UK was and to an extent is. So in terms of rock music in like the 1980s and even the 90s, there was one rock show on Radio 1, so BBC Radio 1 on a Friday night. There was a DJ called Tommy Vance, and there was a 2-hour rock show from 10 o'clock till 12 o'clock. So on the radio, that was the only rock show. 2 hours once a week. So we haven't got all of these other channels and everything that you've got, or other stations that you've got in the States. The only other thing that there was as well was there was Top of the Pops, which was on every Thursday night, half an hour for 7 o'clock. That might sometimes have like one rock band on it.
Right.
So Animal, which is the first single off Hysteria, that's the first one. But other than that, there was also at like 2 o'clock in the morning on a Friday night, early hours of Saturday morning, there was a rock show on the television called The Power Hour, which then changed its name to Raw Power. You had to set your video, your old VHS, and then there was an hour rock show. Yeah, as I said, in the early hours of Saturday morning. And the only other thing, there was another program on a Saturday morning called The Chart Show, and that would have every third week in it. It would have like a little 2-minute segment where there'd be a rock chart, an indie chart, and a dance chart. And that would alternate like on a 3-week rota. So you might quickly catch something in that. And that was it. That was literally it.
Yeah, the world was a much different place before the internet and everything that goes along with that. Because even where we were, we had different stations, but it was still, you just had to go along with what they played. I mean, it wasn't on demand like it is now unless you had the music, but you had to pay for that back then. And that was a big expenditure when you were a kid. You didn't have a ton of cash hanging around. So yeah, it's funny to think about how you were at the mercy of somebody else. Just, I hope something cool comes in next. Or what you really didn't want to do was turn the radio on and have the song be like 99% over. Oh, I just missed it. But I remember like being in high school and like driving around the block again because I want to hear the whole song and I'm not done yet. Yeah, and as much as I love the internet because it gives you information at your fingertips, I think that people don't have that connection anymore with different bands because you can listen to everything.
I think as well, you take a punt, you take a chance on things because you have to. So the way I explained in terms of just going out and buying a single, never having heard it, because you sort of had to do that thing. I do think if a 10-year-old me was out now and the same thing happened, what easily could have happened was, well, you know what, I'll go and listen to it on Spotify. Don't get me wrong, I use streaming services and I like them and I buy my vinyl as well, and I use both, like horses for courses. But I do think of even the way my own way in which I listen to music has changed now. And I do wonder if now I'd put Spotify on, maybe listen to the first 15 seconds of Love Bites, just hear that weird like computery at the start and think, no, I won't bother with that. And then that's it. And then I never invest in it any further.
Listening to the Rock on Tours with Gary Camp and Guy Pratt, they had Joe Elliott on, a few weeks back or whatever. Yeah. And it was a good show. Joe's got this amazing knowledge of British bands. But basically kind of saying how they were the anti-Oasis. Like Oasis couldn't be bigger. They're the biggest band of the last 30 years here. But in America, they're kind of just another band from that 90s era. Whereas for Def Leppard, it's the opposite. Def Leppard's like, okay, they're from the UK and they've got UK fans. But in America, Def Leppard's one of the biggest rock bands of all time.
Yeah, definitely. No, it's interesting. I heard that Joe Elliott interview as well. Obviously, I listen to a lot of Def Leppard interviews and I just have over the years, and that's where you get a lot of your knowledge. But you don't have to go through this, but trust me, if you listen to Joe Elliott's interviews as much as I love them, they're so repetitive. It's like I must have heard Def Leppard say the same thing, like tell the same stories like 100 times. It's like, but there are other people who there's always something new to learn. Def Leppard are they're like Premier League footballers. It's almost like they repeat the same mantra quite a lot, which isn't good when you're trying to make a podcast.
It's got to be tough, though, after a while, because the people want to ask you the same questions. And so, what am I going to do? Make up a whole new story about this? And I guess to those guys' credit, it's interesting and I like the fact that they'll still go on and do interviews. Like, I know guys like Bob Dylan, they won't talk to anybody anymore because it's like there's nothing, you can't ask me anything new. And then I think there was an interview I saw with Gene Simmons where the guy asked him, so where did the name Kiss come from? He's like, really? That's like a 40-year-old question. Like, you got to think of something new or I'm out of here. So yeah, I can imagine that. And maybe after a while, like his brain just kind of switches off too. Like he can tell the story and think about like, so I wonder what's for lunch today. But the fact that to the point before about how, I mean, they're still big in the United States. They still sell out tours, and I would really love to go see them in Vegas because that looks really cool.
Well, so maybe we can explore it a little bit. I mean, if you've watched, and I'm sure you've watched, Hysteria, the Def Leppard story, the kind of low-budget movie that was made about the Def Leps. We saw it on VH1 maybe 20 years ago or something like that. But I did rewatch it, this week to kind of get back into the mindset. And it seemed like because their big single Hello America on Through the Night was Hello America, I feel like the British press was all over them for that. Like, why are you pandering to the colonies? Why don't you just want to be stars in your home country? And I feel like that worked against them. It must have worked against them up through Pyromania, because once you've got Mutt Lange making this incredible record and you've got great videos all over MTV, but you still can't crack the top 10. Photograph doesn't make the top 40. Huh? Is that just because the press was mean to them for wanting to be stars outside of the UK?
I think initially, yes. So that comes about essentially I mentioned that on Through the Night tour, which is Def Leppard's first album, which does really well for a theatre tour. Mm-hmm. They then go to America for only 3 months. They've played everywhere in the UK. Like, they played everywhere, like north and south. Smallest places. They played them twice. They've gone round. They've done it everywhere they can in the UK. They then go to America, and bear in mind, at the same time, Iron Maiden have gone to America and played more shows in America. Right. But obviously, I've got a different image because they're not sort of like, they fit into an idea of like British heavy metal a little bit more, and they belong a little bit more, while sort of Def Leppard is young kids. So, they're quite brash, they're quite confident, they're quite arrogant. They talk openly about wanting to be one of the biggest bands in the world. And you might know, Mac, like living in the UK, that type of thing sort of goes against the grain of like the British mentality. I think in Britain,
until Oasis came along, and then they were all in, apparently. But you're right overall.
Yeah. So anyway, so they go away to America, and during that time, there's a journalist called Jeff Barton, who's the editor of Sounds magazine, which is a big magazine in Britain at the time. And again, these magazines have far more sway than you would have now and again because it's limited access. Sure. And essentially, they run a scathing column as such, or review on Def Leppard. Like, has the Leopard changed its spots? Is the headline on it? And therefore, they then, when they come back to the UK in the summer and they play the Reading Festival and they get bottled off stage and what have you, and they go down really badly. And there's this whole idea of selling out. So that's what initially puts the stops on it. And then I think then what happens then is they just lose their momentum, essentially. But I think there's a difference as well. And you could probably educate me on this a little bit more, and I might be wrong. But I think the difference between the UK and the US in terms of rock music is, it seems to me from an outsider looking in, that in the US, rock music is culturally sort of the working man or woman's music. It's there in the fabric. It's what the majority of people will like rock music to some extent, or metal, or hard rock. Mm-hmm. While in the UK, rock and metal is still to this day more of a subculture. And the music, like the sort of the blue collar music, is like in Britain will be whatever the terrible pop is of the day, or the terrible dance music, or the terrible club music of the day. So therefore, I think where in the States, this type of music, like Photograph and what have you, gets played on the radio and is out there and accessible. I think unless you're part of this subculture who's into rock and metal, then you're not going to hear these Def Leppard songs. And then if the majority of those people who are part of that subculture have decided that Def Leppard have sold out and they've gone against them in some way, that you do effectively get there for 6 or 7 years is almost, literally radio silence when it comes to Def Leppard in the UK, other than a hardcore of fans at that time who liked them.
Okay, so in the United States, I would say that even though it had been that gap of time between Pyromania and then what would become Hysteria, they were still known in the United States. They were still played on the radio, not in top 40 anymore, but now on like rock radio or classic rock radio. So I don't remember them really going away. I mean, it had been a while, but I think that they were still names known to people who were into that. And you're right. I think rock is like the blue collar deal. I mean, that's what you do. I mean, if you heard anybody who, I mean, I don't know what you consider blue collar, but like, anybody that can listen to the radio and do their job during the day, they would play rock music. You're not going to go to a machine shop and hear pop music coming through that. There's no way that's going to happen.
While in Britain, you're probably going to have like Kylie Minogue or something.
I don't want to.
In the mid-'80s.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I love Kylie Minogue, I would want to watch the video with the sound off. That's what I want to see.
But it's interesting to hear you say that because, yeah, I mean, look, we love Iron Maiden too, and we've done several shows on Maiden.
Same here.
But Maiden never got on MTV in America, never. And I think it's just that they're just not pretty enough for American TV. And if you look at Def Leppard, here's young guys. They're nice looking guys. They're blonde. Never underestimate the power of being a bleach blonde in America and how successful you can be. So, yeah, I mean, they did an amazing job getting onto MTV and staying there. It seems like they had some good management. Picked them up with Q Prime, Cliff Bernstein, who eventually also did Metallica, and Peter Mensch. They kind of hit it big in America, but the Iron Maidens, for whatever reason, although certainly popular, were more of a subgenre, whereas Def Leppard just couldn't have really been any bigger.
That's interesting, too, your point about the thinking in Britain is that we're not brash, we don't, promote ourselves. That's Iron Maiden right there. Either you like their music or you don't. The people that like it love it. They're not interested in being mainstream. They're not interested in being pop music. But yeah, I remember growing up, there were a couple, not so much my age, but guys like you that would have an older brother. Everybody had Maiden stuff on their wall. And I remember when Power Slave came out and just thinking that's the coolest thing I've ever seen, that the cover with the pyramids and everything. But I'd never heard any of the music before. So it's definitely, Def Leppard was kind of in the middle. They didn't have that kind of following, but they definitely had a rock radio following in the United States that I think everybody had a copy of Pyromania somewhere, either on tape or on a record, or they knew somebody, so they had a copy somewhere. It was all over the place.
Yeah, and I think Iron Maiden grew their audience in a different way. So it sort of culminates, because I used to love watching a Live After Death video when I was a kid. And that's obviously like Long Beach Arena. Now, I don't know how big Long Beach Arena is in real life, but on that Live After Death video, it looks enormous. It looks absolutely huge. And that's a culmination of what they did, is pretty much 1980, 1981, 82, 83, 84. For every year for 5 years, they released an album a year. And they tore it to death. I mean, like, Bruce Dickinson nearly has a nervous breakdown on the World Slavery tour, and like nearly quits Iron Maiden at the end of it. So it was quite interesting that they released essentially twice as many albums as Def Leppard in that time, and it's almost like they have to do it that way. While Def Leppard do get the luxury as such of maybe a more commercial, accessible sound, but don't play anywhere near as much. So by the time you get to that stage, in terms of how the venues that they're playing and everything, there might not be a massive difference.
No, it's interesting that you bring that up, because I mean, obviously 4.5 years between albums wasn't the plan, and we can get into all the things that kept them from making the album in 1984, 1985. But just looking at some of their peers of the day, U2, who are not exactly known to rush out albums, put out War, Unforgettable Fire, and Joshua Tree between the release of Pyromania Hysteria. That's 50 million in album sales right there, right? Iron Maiden made Peace of Mind, Power Slave, Live After Death, and Somewhere in Time. That's a lot of classic, amazing work, not to mention all the touring that you were talking about. And then, the Cult, who we love and have done a couple shows on, did their first 3 albums, Dreamtime, Love, and Electric, all came out. Even Van Halen had 2 albums with 2 different lead singers, between that time. So it's like, it wouldn't surprise people if Def Leppard never came back from that. And obviously there are people who were concerned that that's exactly what was going to happen.
I think including the band. Because I know the stuff that I've seen, like when they were getting ready to roll this thing out, it was make or break. Like either this thing was going to be big or they were going down in flames, because they'd been recording on and off in some way or another since about the Pyromania time, correct? Like putting things together and stopping and starting. So by the time the record actually came out, they had spent so much money that they needed something big, or they were going to be in trouble.
Yeah, I think they needed to forget the exact figure, but it's something along the lines of they needed to sell 3 or 4 million albums just to break even. So
and in 1987, that's an insane. I mean, like in the kind of the height. So like maybe 91, that was kind of the height of record sales. That might not have been that big of a deal, but in 1987, to say, okay, listen, boys, we got to sell 4 million copies before we start making a dime, probably wasn't going to happen if you played the odds. So, and then they started putting out singles that didn't do as well as they thought they would. I can imagine there were a lot of nights where they're like, we're in trouble. This might be the end of the story here.
Oh yeah, definitely, and especially and that story as well. I mean, you're correct in terms of they finished the Pyromania tour at the end of 1983, and it's the beginning of 1984 that they moved to Dublin in Ireland for tax reasons, and that's when they start writing Hysteria. They move into a house in like the suburbs of Dublin, and they all pile into this one house. Mutt Lang, the producer, actually moves in with them for those initial writing sections. And it's interesting, songs like Animal, they're written in those first sessions in a house in the suburbs of Dublin in March 1984. But then and it's quite interesting because you can hear the demos from then. And that song's pretty much still sounds, all of the main parts of it are still there. It's still recognizable as the song Animal. That's written in like March, April 1984. It doesn't come out until 1987. So that's it. That song is in existence for 3 years before it actually comes out.
Yeah, and the other thing that was interesting too during that time and then into the Hysteria days was everybody in the United States knew about like Motley Crue, about what they would do, their partying lifestyles. Everybody knew about Ozzy Osbourne, but then they're like, oh yeah, Def Leppard. Like, what? Def Leppard? No. They kind of flew under the radar as far as like being hellacious party animals. But apparently, yeah, like I saw Joe Elliott said, like, yeah, we used to stack up like the cans and the bottles and everything just to kind of see the carnage the next day. And that's just insane to think about all those guys in one house just going crazy. That would be that's the Joe Elliott story I want to hear. Forget everything else. I want to hear about, and then you did what? Yeah, we were up for 3 days and doing crazy stuff.
Yeah, and the crew did Shout at the Devil, Theater of Pain, and Girls, Girls, Girls between these 2 records, right? So they took a lot of the, they took maybe some of the fans. It's like Def Leppard's not around, and they weren't touring because they didn't have a drummer. So, they're kind of taking their place and rising up through the ranks. Hopefully you all can hear how much fun Jackson and I are having Neil from Def Lep Pod on. We're really enjoying our conversation, learning a lot from him, and just having fun meeting somebody and talking to someone who loves rock music the way we do. So make sure you follow Neil, Def Lep Pod, a Def Leppard podcast, at Def Lep Pod on Twitter. Now back to the show. I want to talk about Steve Clark because I just see him as a real tragic figure in the history of rock and roll. A very talented player, underrated certainly in the U.S., like Jackson said, kind of has a Jimmy Page's quality to him in that he's not super precise. He played with heart, he played with soul. He may not have been the most precise person in the world, but it came through in his music, and I guess he was just a guy who didn't have confidence in himself. It sounds like his father was a jerk to him when he was a young man and didn't believe in what he was doing. And then he crawled into a bottle, and then obviously bad things started to happen to him. I mean, what's your kind of feeling about Steve Clark? And was Hysteria his best?
I think you're definitely right in terms of there's a lack of confidence there. And he's absolutely plagued, especially on a Hysteria tour, with stage fright, where even though he's amazing and he's probably most comfortable when he's on stage, he actually doesn't want to go on stage. And we don't actually really know exactly what's going on, but there are like you said, I think there is maybe a difficult relationship with his dad. And in terms of, and also as well, the thing that you mentioned about Jimmy Page. I mean, Jimmy Page was absolutely an idol, and you can see that from like how low he wears his guitar, the 2-necked guitar, the scarf around the neck. He very much stylistically and the way in presentation stylizes himself on Jimmy Page. Jimmy Page is his massive hero. Is he at his best on Hysteria? I think what's really good about Steve Clark is there's at least one iconic Steve Clark song on every Def Leppard album. So on Through the Night, Wasted is all about Steve Clark. On High and Dry, there's an instrumental song called Twitch 625. That's all Steve Clark.
Cool.
You see Def Leppard when they actually play that live, they normally have like a montage of Steve Clark on the big screen in the background. On Pyromania, which I know you've discussed, great episode by the way, you've got Die Hard the Hunter, which is very much Steve Clark's song in terms of the riffs and everything.
Great song.
And then on it's brilliant. That's in my top 5 Def Leppard songs. And then on Hysteria, the archetypal Steve Clark song is Gods of War. And I think the one thing that you can sort of see with Steve Clark is he brings a lot of the heaviness to Def Leppard, especially after Pete Willis left after the High and Dry album. Mm-hmm. He brings a lot of the heaviness, he brings a lot of the riffs, he brings a lot of like the cool ideas, and he brings a lot of maybe the more epic songs or the songs with a little bit more gravitas, where musically they have a bit of gravitas. So Def Leppard are forced into, writing a song that isn't just about women and love and that type of thing. And in terms of Gods of War, I would argue probably that is the pinnacle, that is the high point of Steve Clark's contributions to Def Leppard in terms of the song that it manifests itself into. And without Steve Clark, there's no way a song like Gods of War on Hysteria album even exists. And he very much saw that in terms of, I think, in terms of length, it's only like 6 minutes, but the rest of the band, when you read the interviews, you see, I think Joe Elliott was happy that in Gods of War, Steve Clark got his Kashmir. Now, not to say that it's as epic as Kashmir,
sure.
And Led Zeppelin fans will be falling over now at the idea of me comparing Def Leppard to Led Zeppelin, and that's fine. But in terms of just within the context of Def Leppard, writing that epic song very much is all about Steve Clark, and I think that is his high point, and it's there on the Hysteria album.
Yeah, I think that you go back to, you're talking about that being Kashmir, but I think that's the really cool part, and I think that's the cool part when you listen to this genre of music. You can hear, or you can think of a young Steve Clark listening to and watching Jimmy Page and just saying, I want to be that guy. I want to approximate it. So the next step is to try and write a song like that. And I think that's really cool. But the other thing we were going to talk about real quick was that Hysteria movie that we saw on VH1. And the one scene, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I really hope it is the scene where Steve is standing in the hallway of the recording studio and Phil walks by and he's just playing something that sounds a lot like Pour Some Sugar on Me. And Phil, what is that? I don't know, just something I'm messing with. Like, get over here and let's do this right now. Like the fact that he could just come up with riffs like that. And Gods of War isn't super intricate, but it's straight ahead and it's really cool. And it's just, you're right, it's got his stamp on it. This is what I do.
Unfortunately, the bit from the Def Leppard film, pretty saying that's not true, just simply because Pour Some Sugar on Me comes about from Joe Elliott messing around in the studio when Hysteria is actually completed and they're not going to write any more songs. Right. And he's just there like in a tea break or whatever, and he's messing around and he's come up with the chorus to Pour Some Sugar on Me. And then Mutt Lange hears it and said, oh, that's good, let's do something about it. And then a few days later, the rest of the band come back and they have to break the news that they think they've got another song that they need to record. Bearing in mind, they've been at it for 4 years. Right. So maybe Steve did add the main riff. I'm not too sure, but I think in terms of how the origin story of that song is probably a little bit different. There might be a little bit of poetic license in the film to make their narrative work.
Sure. Right. But, the thing you were saying, too, about people being Def Leppard fans, and if you asked, I don't know, I'm just trying to think of like people that I've met since I was in college that are my age or, maybe around there. And you would ask them like, oh, hey, do you like Def Leppard? No, not really. You Pour Some Sugar on Me. Everybody knows that. Oh, I love this. Of course you do. I remember this was on when I was in fill in the blank, middle school, high school, college, whatever. Yes. Oh, that's definitely, yes. And then I think if you put on the rest of the record, they would like the rest of the record also. Even if either you never heard it before or it's been a while, it's just the music, especially on Hysteria, it straddled the line between being, if you like rock, you could like it, and if you were a top 40 person in the United States, you could like it also.
Yeah, see, Jackson, that's what I want to get into because I think Def Leppard's sound, the basis of it and the way we like it is for two things. One is the riff from Steve and the way that he and Phil play together because we love guitars. But the defining piece of Def Leppard's sound is the harmony backing vocals to me. Nobody sings like Def Leppard does. And I'm curious if you know, Neil, who's most responsible for that? I mean, besides Mutt Lange, is Savage the best lead singer? Do they track Joe Elliott on every backing track? Because when they do it live, Clark didn't sing that much, but Savage certainly did. Phil does. And Rick Allen had his headphones on while he's playing the drums. So do they balance it? I mean, what do you know about making that Def Leppard backing vocal sound?
Yeah, those backing vocals have really evolved from the first, the second to the third to the fourth album, which is Hysteria. So if you listen on the first two Def Leppard albums, you've got Joe Elliott who can obviously sing, and then you've got Rick Savage who can sing as well. There are other backing vocals where you get Pete Willis and Steve Clark and Rick Allen, but it's very much more in the way that us three, if we went to the pub and had a pint and the song came on really loud and we could hold half a tune and sing, a catchy chorus, it would sound okay if you put like a load of reverb on our voice, as opposed to it's all harmonies and things. That then takes a step up for the first time on the Pyromania album when Phil Collen comes in, because Phil Collen can sing.
Right.
And Phil Collen can sound a lot like Joe Elliott as well, which is it's a little bit strange. So through the Hysteria tour, you've got like those three-part harmonies. You've got Joe, you've got Phil, and you've got Rick Savage, who they call Sav. That actually then improves again to the state that you're in now. When in 1992, after the death of Steve Clark, Vivian Campbell joins the band.
Right.
And he can really sing as well. So when you hear Def Leppard live now, they suffer a little bit from what Queen did back in the day in terms of people think it's tapes and what have you.
Right.
But there is actually a real ability there to actually harmonise and put all of those backing vocals together. So in terms of backing vocals, they're as good now and have been since 1992 as they've ever been. On the actual recordings, though, you do find Mutt Lange on there. You even get his wife at the time, Stevie Lange. She's on there. And I know what they do is they are like, you got double tracking. Well, I think that they don't just double track, they'll sort of loop it around. So it's like literally tens and tens.
Okay.
And you probably haven't heard it, which is fine. But on Def Leppard's 2015 album, which is like the self-titled album, there's a song on that called We Belong, where in the verses, every single member of the band sings. So like they have their own like couple of lines each.
Wow.
And it's a weird one because die-hard Def Leppard fans might hate me for saying this, but when you hear the voices individually, other than Joe Elliott, they sound a little bit strange. But together, when you put it together, then it sounds really good. But yeah, I think that's an example of how the vocals have grown and being important. I mean, it culminates in the latest album with them all actually singing individually on one song.
That's pretty neat.
I'm gonna take a listen to that because that sounds really cool. Because you're right, I'm sure it would sound. Putting it all together is the classic Def Leppard sound. And I mean, to your point, they definitely got a plus with Vivian Campbell because he is he was in the Dio band. I mean, he's a great player. But it's just you didn't really want him there because you wanted Steve Clark to go on forever in the band. Yeah,
because we saw them together on that Adrenalize tour, man, in the Orlando Arena in the round, and it was amazing. Jackson and I were both like, oh, this will be good. This will be a fun show. But we'd already seen Rush and Van Halen in that arena, so it was like, this probably won't be as good as that. And we were blown away, like, this is amazing. First of all, we know every single song. Secondly, the stage was cool as hell. And it's got to be hard work to cover all that. It's one thing to go out to this way to 20,000 people, but to have 20, 25,000 people everywhere you go, that's hard work, man. And they pulled it off magically. They were so good. I call all my friends and tell them, you'll never believe how good Def Leppard is live, man. They're so awesome.
Yeah, definitely. That's the first tour that not only was that the first tour that I saw them on in 1992 on the Adrenalize tour, I saw them in Birmingham in the UK. That was the very first gig I went to, was seeing them in the round. And it's interesting what you were saying earlier, Action, about, in the early 80s, they might have been up there with doing the stereotypical rock and roll thing, getting drunk and what have you. It's actually those tours playing in the round, especially the Hysteria tour in 87 and 88, where that's when Joe Elliott goes teetotal and stops drinking. And it's simply because he realizes after like, I think on the first show he does there's a story he tells where like after the fourth song he's like hyperventilating and throwing up because he's been running around that much and he's just not healthy enough to do it. So on that 87-88 tour on Hysteria, that's when you actually start getting like Joe Elliott stops drinking totally because he thinks I'm not going to be able to do this tour unless I you're burning a candle at both ends. And then over time, Phil Collins stops drinking. I mean, He goes like vegetarian and vegan and everything. And then what then happens? You've got this sort of like band of brothers, sort of these like British fellas who all like, go down to the pub and drink. And then they all slowly stop doing that until you're just left with Steve Clark, who hasn't stopped doing it, and all of a sudden he's lost his drinking buddies and what have you, and then obviously he's sort of in a, he's got like mental health issues or sort of, whatever it is, like anxiety and all of the other things going, and then all of a sudden to sort of lose that social bond maybe, and it's just sort of be the one left, right, and obviously that leaves him in a slightly isolated position compared to where maybe he's being like sort of mid-80s when they were all at it during Pyromania.
Right.
Yeah, and so then you go from being depressed to being super depressed because now you feel like you're all by yourself, even though I'm sure if you asked all those guys at that time, they would say, no, we still loved him. We still wanted to include him, but you just kind of pushed yourself farther and farther back. There was another, I don't know if you've heard of the brand Rat.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, of course you have, because they're awesome. From the 80s. But that was the same thing with the guitarist Robin Crosby. It was the same exact thing. He just pushed himself farther and farther back because he felt like everybody was kind of abandoning him. Like we're all, we're a band together. We all do everything together. We play, we live together, we go out and get drunk together. And then, I think we're going to turn in early. We got a big day tomorrow. No, we're going out to party. So it's just that dynamic of being left all alone. I can imagine it just pushed him even farther down into the hole that he was in and made it difficult for everybody. I mean, I can imagine that tour was probably not easy for anyone either.
It is. I don't know if you've ever heard the journalist and writer. It's called Mick Wall. He's got his own podcast actually called Get You.
I got a few of his books. He's been with everybody. Yeah. I got a Sabbath book. I got all his books. Yeah.
Yeah. So I made them one and everything. But he tells the story of he was traveling with the band during in the States on the Hysteria tour, and there's an episode where they're on like the private jet flying from one gig to another, and there's a malfunction in the plane. Something happens where all of a sudden plane starts plummeting out of the sky. It drops 2,000 feet. It actually drops to the extent that they experience zero gravity within the cabin because it dropped that fast. So it's like in space. Obviously, they don't die.
Right.
It's okay. And then afterwards, everyone's like, "Oh bloody hell, that was mad. Whew, I thought I was gonna die then." And he turned to Steve Clark, and he's not asleep or anything, but he's just to excuse the pun, I think he's quite wasted. Didn't even notice it. Wow. Didn't even notice that it happened. So it sort of shows you like how maybe even during that tour there's just a difference in like sort of the perceptions of reality and what's going on and that different members of the band have got.
Yeah, no, I saw Mick Wall. Sorry, Jay, I saw Mick Wall on the VH1 Behind the Music. Mick Wall said Steve Clark was the unhappiest rock star millionaire, that he'd ever met in his life. It's like you're good looking, you're in your 20s, you've got all the money you want, you can have women, you do these big gigs, and yet he couldn't stand it, and he would like hit his hands on the sink before the show. So it's like, if I break my hand, I can't go on, they can't make me do it. I'm like, good Lord, how many people would trade places with you in a second, and yet he wanted no part of it, and that's why I feel like this poor guy. Your heart has to go out to someone like that,
Yeah, and I think as shown with what happens to Rick Allen when he has his accident and he loses his arm, Def Leppard have actually because their band is based on sort of like friendship, like ultimately, and sort of and through the years, they've always been like really good. They're like a loyal band with each other. They're not one of these bands where they all hate each other. They wouldn't bother doing it anymore if they didn't like each other. That type of band. And obviously they supported Rick Allen, but with Steve Clark it was the same. Essentially, where in the period, he dies on January the 8th, 1991. He dies, but during that period, they're making Adrenalize. He's not in a good way. He's being in rehab or whatever, and they actually give him like sort of like 6 months gardening leave as such, in terms of, listen, no pressure, don't worry about the album, we'll crack on with that. You just go and look after yourself, go and, do what you need to do, go and live in your own house, sleep in your own bed. You don't, we're not on tour anymore, hang out with your girlfriend, whatever. And they actually gave him like just sort of 6 months to just go and chill out. It's like, we'll crack on with the album. But obviously, they never got to the end of that 6 months.
Yeah, sad.
Yeah, there was I remember Joe Elliott saying, like, almost at the end, they would go and visit him and say, okay, we love you. You got to get better. You got to get better. And he was just like, yeah, okay, cool. Yep. Thanks for coming by. Like, he was just done. Like, he was just done being alive. He did not want to do it anymore. And that to have somebody, to your point, I mean, they'd been together for a long time. Like, I think Rick Allen was, like 16 or 17 when he joined the band. To have that to see your
50.
friend, I mean, forget rock star, forget band, forget anything. Your friend just, nope, I'm done. It's got to be heartbreaking for those guys. And then to have, maybe you think to yourself, okay, he'll hit bottom and then he'll come back. He'll realize that someday, and he just never did, and he just left the earth. That has to be just so painfully hard. And then, if you want to take a step back to the Rick Allen arm being ripped off, and then have them say, I mean, wait, you got to have that conversation. You have to have that conversation. You can't play the drums anymore. You can't. There's no way. We've got to go on. And then him saying, I think I can do this. Mm-hmm. And them saying, oh, I mean, okay, well, we'll give you a shot, because again, you've got this thing. This is a giant corporation now. I mean, this has to go on, and we can't have a rock drummer with one arm. That can't happen. But yet it did. And it's one of the greatest stories ever that he could come back from that and be successful. And yeah, I know that they tweak the kit that he plays drums, but he also has the loops that he does. But to put it all together is just amazing.
I mean, it's interesting because obviously I get into Def Leppard after this has happened. And also I get into them when I'm 10. And you just go, oh, the drummer's got one arm. Yeah. Obviously, okay. you don't think too much of it. From your point of view, obviously, you've known a 2-arm Rick Allen and you've liked Pyromania, and then this happens. What did you think when you heard about that then, in terms of how did that story come through in the States, and what did you think? Because obviously I'm after the fact now, where it's like, I know obviously he had 2 arms and I've heard those albums now, but when I first got into them, that was just sort of the story set. What about you two? What was your sort of experience of hearing about that in the States?
I don't remember hearing about it too much before the record came out, but I remember seeing the videos and then saying, wait, time out. I'm missing something here. It's a trick. He's not really playing the drums. Obviously, they had somebody else come in. It's already done. He's just kind of air drumming this. And then to learn more about it, and then to learn about, because I kind of heard about the accident. I'm trying to remember exactly. And I didn't know. I just know that he was in an accident. The arm came off. I didn't know anything the rest of that. And then to learn more, like, no, he's really doing this. It was incredible to me. And just to see him out there, I'm like, that. Oh, I'm having a bad day. My car won't start. I'm not feeling that well today. I only have one arm, and I go out and kick ass all over the world. It's fantastic. And I remember when Adrenalize came out, and they did a photo shoot for, I think it was Rolling Stone, and he had a picture without his shirt on. And, I mean, there's nothing there. I mean, there's not even a shoulder. It just goes straight down. That was just very eye-opening to see that. Like, wow, there's nothing there.
No, I remember when it happened, and obviously that's a big reason why they didn't make a record for 4.5 years, because they had to kind of get him back. And then I think Mutt was out of the picture. Jim Steinman of Meatloaf fame was going to come in and do it. And then it's like, okay, that's not right. He's not a producer. He writes songs. We can write our songs. We need a producer. So eventually, because it took so long, Mutt could come back, like, thank God. And then I think he had a car accident and broke his leg or something like that to make things go even longer. But see, I remember this very well. It was the summer of '87. You mentioned that Animal was the first single off the record. In July in the UK, that's right. But in America, the first single was Women. And MTV used to do this thing called World Premiere Video. Like, tonight, we'll have the first time ever that you've ever seen whomever. And one night in August, I remember I was getting ready, it's like school's coming up. I probably had soccer practice, or football as they call it here, practice the next day. But I was staying up late because I'm like, hey, Def Leppard, I haven't heard from them in years. And now they've got this new song coming out. Their drummer only has one arm. I'm really curious as to how this works. And then the song is Women. And I'm like, wow. They kind of suck now, man. Like, no offense, but I'm like, of the 7 singles, Women is easily the worst in my opinion, and certainly the charts say that. It didn't even chart in the UK. It got to 80 in mainstream rock. And for your first song back in 4 years to be the one that barely does anything. And I think it was Cliff Bernstein of Q Prime's like, no, you need to put women out. This will get your hard rock audience back. What a mistake. I mean, that could have been not a single, and they could have made Gods of War. Love and Affection was kind of almost a single. It got a lot of radio play in America. I guess they didn't release it, but we heard it on the radio all the time, right, Jackson?
Yeah. And I honestly, going through that, I didn't know that wasn't it could have gone either way for me, that being a single or not. But yeah, it then goes back to they released Women and also had to sell 4 million copies.
It's like,
oops.
Yeah.
Swing and a miss.
Yeah, and they still talk about that today. I mean, to be honest, if you watch, there's an Hysteria classic albums where, they tell that story about Joe Elliott to this day not understanding why Women was released as the first single in the US. It wasn't released at all in the UK. So there was 6 singles in the UK, 7 in America. And I suppose it's interesting, we were talking about what's the differences between the UK and the US. There must be some difference to the extent that very experienced managers, Cliff Bernstein and Peter Mensch, by that time, unbelievably successful. So they obviously they know what they're doing, but they've determined that you need to do something different in the States than you do in the UK. But on that occasion, they've got it wrong, because women's. I mean, I love the song Women, but it's an album track quite clearly, as opposed to a single. And then obviously Animal comes out in the UK, and that's their first hit in the UK. I don't know if it necessarily would have done the same in America. I think the reason it wasn't released in America is it was considered maybe too poppy or too rocky. And what they wanted to do in America was release Women to sort of show that they still had their rock chops as such. They still had this rock element to them, and maybe Animal was considered too, mid-paced, too poppy or whatever. But I mean, Animal does amazingly well. It's the biggest, to this day, it's their third biggest hit in the UK. It goes in at number 6, and that's going in at number 6 back in the day when you got to sell a fair few singles to get in at number 6. So the actual experience for the first time is flipped, where they've always been successful in the US. When Hysteria first comes out and with the initial singles, it's like it doesn't hit in the States with this release of Women, but for the first time in the UK, it's like they're in the top 10, and all of a sudden people are going, oh, Def Leppard, are they a new band? No, they've been around for 10 years.
That's right. And Animal did come out, in September of 87, but it hit the top 20 mainstream rock and top 5 top 20 Billboard 100 and then top 5 mainstream rock. So it's like, okay, we rebounded from the Women thing. And then they mix it up a little bit now between the UK and the US, because about the time they released Animal in the US, they released Pour Some Sugar on Me in the UK with the original first video, which may have been recorded from that house that they had in Ireland, right, Neil?
It wasn't the actual, you're right, it is a house and it is in Ireland, and it's the house it belongs to the mum of the drum tech at the time, Paddy Feenan, I think his name is. Wow. So it's not the actual house. Actually, sorry, I've got that wrong. His house is the one that features in the video to Be In My Wine. The house that features in Pour Some Sugar on Me, again, it is in Ireland, but it's actually not a house. It's a little hotel, like a little bed and breakfast.
Oh, okay.
Like a guest house that was actually being demolished. And that's the same hotel or guest house that a lot of the band's family stayed in when they were, in Dublin for all of those years, or for quite a lot of that time, writing that song. So there is a connection between that building and Def Leppard and their time in Dublin, but only in the sense that it's the hotel that their family stayed in.
Now that's the kind of knowledge we like on the Ugly American Werewolf in London, Neil. That is what we are after, the minutia that the average person doesn't even understand why you would know that. We want to know that stuff. That's why you're on, and we appreciate it.
Cool. I don't know how much is worth actually knowing, to be honest.
But all right, so Pour Some Sugar on Me's third, because the third single in America was Armageddon It, and I got to tell you, I've always loved this song. This has always been my favorite song. I think it's my favorite song on the album. I loved the video. I love the girls in the video from the McNichols Arena in Denver, man. I guess that was off In the Round in Your Face. But it gets to number 3 on the Billboard charts, which is a big deal, and also does well on rock mainstream. And then it's like, okay, now we're doing it. Now we're building, right? And that helped them get to maybe 3 million in overall sales by the end of '87, which is pretty good, except A, Pyromania did double that in America, on the last one. And B, like you said, they had to sell 4 million or more just to break even before they could actually start to make money on the record again. And of course, Hysteria came out next, but when Pour Some Sugar on Me hit America,
like a
boy.
gasoline bomb went off.
Because
I remember that. Yeah, it went from, you couldn't get away from it. It was on all the time. It was on rock radio. It was on Top 40 radio. It was on MTV all time. I'm like, all right, but let's move on here. Do we have another one? Because it was so prolific in the United States.
Yeah, slutty girls love Pour Some Sugar on Me, And I even saw an interview
still do.
They do. Oh yeah, and Joe Elliott was like, I think it started in strip clubs in Florida, and then it started to work its way west. I'm like, it worked its way all over the Midwest, man.
Right, when you were talking about the video of when they were in the house that I've seen before, I really liked that one that I guess it was the U.S. one where it starts with the black and white, and they've got the rigging, and it's just Joe Elliott saying, love me like a bomb, bomb,
hit me like a bomb,
and then it goes into that. I like that, the noodling on the guitar, and then the drum, boom, 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 and then they go into the song. I don't know if that's like an alternate version, or I've never heard it other than watching the video, but I just think that that's a really cool take on the song.
Yeah, it's a different mix to it's a different video to the UK version, and it's a slightly different mix because, as you said, it's got that different intro where it's got love is like a bomb, that bit, and then there's like a weird scraping noise where there's like a little sort of almost like sample at the beginning of it,
and then
it kicks in,
and then he drops the drums in, and that sounds awesome.
And in the video as well, the video absolutely, the way sometimes a video can accompany a song, and sometimes the right video can really elevate a song, and that is your absolutely prime example of that doing that, because when it kicks in as well, that bit at the beginning that you see, that's when they're actually in the round at the beginning, when the curtain's still up, and it hasn't dropped yet, and then as it kicks in with the main parts of Pour Some Sugar on Me and the drums, the curtains drop, and then you just got this really cool montage video, and I can't remember off the top of my head the name of the director, but I think he's the same in the late 80s. He's doing really good concert footage. So he's the same man who did the Lay Your Hands on Me video by Bon Jovi, which is like a really good live video.
Okay.
As well. That video and that song, they're perfectly matched. And you go from quite a sort of twee British version, which is very much like a bit of a sort of 1970s sitcom throwback, very sort of insular British type of video, to this in the States, in the round. There's this really cool video, it's really loads of fast edits, and you've got all the black and white bits behind the scenes sort of edited in, and it's just, that video literally makes the song sound 10 times better than if you're watching it with the other videos. So I can see why it exploded that much in the States, but we never got that version.
Oh, boo, because we like we were talking about before, we saw them on the Adrenalize tour, and it was pretty much the same kind of setup and vibe. And when they're going to drop the curtain, it's going to happen. You've seen it a million times, but when they actually do, it is just, you talk about stand up and cheer. That's fantastic. Just a boom, and it comes down, and they start the show. And to see it from the other angle with them on stage getting ready, and then you see the crowd out. That's fantastic. Yeah,
that was Russell Mulcahy who did that. He did a lot of great, not only videos, but concert films over the years. He worked with a lot of the big artists. But then at that point they're solidified. I read that they sold 3 million units up until Pour Some Sugar on Me came out in the U.S. And then when it did, during its run on the charts, they sold 4 million more just during Pour Some Sugar on Me being on the charts, which, by the way, went to number 2 in America. It was nudged out by Hold On to the Night by Richard Marx. So all my friends over here in England are always asking me, what's wrong with America? What's going on in America? I point to that right there. So you want to know what's wrong with America? That's the problem. The people make Pour Some Sugar on Me number one, but the corporations that kind of run stuff, like, now we need a Richard Marx hit to be number one right now. None of this Def Leppard stuff.
The same thing. There's only one time that Def Leppard had been, two, but one really, that they got close to being number one. And that's when Let's Get Rock came out, the first single on Adrenalize. And that was kept off the top of the charts in the UK by a band. I don't know if you've heard of them in the States, called Simply Red.
Oh, sure.
Anyway, so singer's Mick Hucknall. He's got like long red curly hair, and we've got an awful song called Fairground. It's just it's a war crime of a song. It's awful, and that kept Let's Get Rock off number one, and I'll never forgive the British public for that.
Well, I think Simply Red's a one-hit wonder with, what's the song, Gary?
Holding back the years.
Holding back the years, and we don't know any, it's like Gary Kemp, it's like Spandau Ballet and Duran Duran, we were neck and neck all those years. I'm like, really? Because in America, you got one song and that's it, whereas Duran Duran are kind of like the Beatles of their era in America, but they've got 24 hits in the UK and Europe. It's like Gold was this big, I never heard Gold until I moved here. It's like the A&R people must have screwed over Spandau Ballet in the U.S., But seriously, I mean, then they're on a huge roll, right? Because Animal's 19 in the American charts, Armageddon, it's number 3, Hysteria's top 10, then Pour Some Sugar on Me, and they're huge. And then they get to your song, Love Bites, the 6th single in America, goes all the way to number 1 on both sides of the Atlantic, right? That's a huge deal.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, that song, because I do think back to myself, like, singing it at the top of my lungs when I'm 10 years old. I'm thinking, making love to you, and I drive me crazy.
That's
I'm thinking, wondering what my mum and dad were thinking about that, but yeah. Well, yeah, it'll have a special place in my heart, that song.
They were yelling at your brother, you made him listen to this. And that's interesting, too, because we talk about this a lot on the show. A song that if you took it out and put it on its own, you might say, but the one that holds a special place in your heart, like you knew that was the first song that you listened to. So no matter what, nobody ever can bag on it. You remember going to the record store, bringing it home, putting it on your hi-fi system and just listening to it a million times. You'll never get over that. You'll never have anybody tell you, oh, that's not a great song. No, it's a fantastic song. You be quiet.
And I've still got it to this day. I mean, it's not here with me now. It's downstairs, but I've still got the 12-inch single.
Nice.
And it's funny because I've written on it as a 10-year-old, where I've written my name and I put 1988 on it. I'd never write on a record now. I don't know what I was thinking. But I've written my name in like the Def Leppard lettering on it and everything. So it's quite nice. But it's probably not that interesting. But what's funny with that is that quite quickly on that, the Billy's Got a Gun live on the B-side got scratched. And so I was listening to that version of Billy's Got a Gun. I felt like, probably over a year before I actually got round to buying Pyromania. And there's a scratch in the verse, and it's a scratch where it sticks, as opposed to where it jumps.
Oh, no.
And because I just listened to it for a year in formative years, I can't listen to Billy's Got a Gun to this day without expecting to hear that scratch.
To your point, Jackson, if you didn't like Def Leppard in 1988, 89 in America, especially in the Midwest where I grew up, you're shit out of luck because you're going to have to hear them everywhere. You're going to hear them in the parking lot. You're going to hear them on the radio. Your mom's going to know some of the songs. Your older brothers, they're going to play them at ball games. They're all over MTV. And because they had 6 top 20 pop hits, not mainstream rock, but Billboard 100, 6 of them. And of course, the videos were all over MTV. You had to succumb to Def Leppard. And I remember for about 6 straight weeks there, because I love Armageddon. I think the harmonies are amazing in it. And Come On, Steve, Get It. I just think that's great. He's calling him out to give a killer solo. I think it's cool. Every night between 10:30 and 11 during the week on MTV, they played that song. I'm like, my mom's yelling at me to go to bed for school. I'm like, look, just give me 10 minutes. They're going to play Def Leppard. I know they are. And they did. Every night for 6 weeks. I could set my watch by it. So you had to be into it, because if you weren't, well, it was just unfortunate to be you.
And it was cool when you finally got the copy of it and to listen to the rest of the record and say, okay, especially Gods of War. To me, that was the one where it was like, why have I not heard this before? This is fantastic. And what I wanted to ask you, Neil, is Rocket. Is that we're fighting for the gods of war at the beginning of that, the backward part?
Yeah, it's that backwards.
Okay.
Fed into that song. Yes.
Okay, because for me, it was. Then I know when that came out too, like, oh, is that a message? Are they trying to something satanic? Like, it's just bad. They just ran the tape backwards. I mean, it's something you can't tell what it is, but it's just a cool intro to a song, also, because you knew what it was, and it wasn't like anything else either.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. I only learned that was so. The start of Rocket is the chorus to Gods of War backwards.
Mm-hmm.
I only learned that from watching this Hysteria classic album. I would never have known that otherwise. And there's all other little bits as well, like in Love Bites. There's just like little noises where they've taken the B out of Love Bites, and then they've triggered it in a different song and put an effect on. And I think there's lots of different mixes of quite a few songs off Hysteria that go on many of the B-sides from the Hysteria album. And you can see how, like, from a production point of view, how malleable those songs are, where, you can take a bit from there and invert it and turn it around and put that bit there. It's like a jigsaw almost. And it's quite, I mean, while those mixes, they're okay, they're nowhere near as good as the originals. And if anything, those mixes sort of show you how restraint is important. Mm-hmm. Because having an 8.5-minute version of, like, Rocket, you don't need that. to be frank,
I agree.
But it is interesting the way in which you can sort of see that those songs can be looped into each other and what have you. It's quite a sort of good exercise in that, I guess.
Well, and it's interesting to bring that point up because this is the longest record they still ever made. I'm fairly certain, over 62 minutes. Yeah. And I'm looking at it, Gods of War, is like 6.5 minutes, and it's a 6.5-minute song. Whereas Rocket has this middle part with all these samples and stuff like that. I know it was popular at the time, and Robert Plant was doing it on his solo albums, sampling some of his Zeppelin stuff. And I didn't like it then, and I still really don't like it that much. And like it's a 4.5, 5-minute song that you've stretched out just as long as Gods of War, kind of unnecessarily, in my opinion. Then you're right, they've got all these other mixes, I guess, for the club, which is more popular in Europe than it is in America to do that for rock bands. We've talked about that on this show before. But do you have a favorite mix of any of the songs? If they remix or do an edit, is there one that stands out to you?
I think the album versions of all of the songs are best. I prefer the album version of Rocket to the radio edit, personally, because I think the radio edit is about 4 minutes. Rocket's a really interesting song in terms of Rocket, along with Love Bites, are two songs that they often try to do something a little bit different with when they play live. Mm-hmm. Most Def Leppard songs are played with a straight bat, and they're played live how they sound on the record. But with Rockets, for example, that it's interesting that you say about like Led Zeppelin and Robert Plant. So during that Adrenalize tour, especially when they played the Don Valley Stadium in Sheffield, it was like a big homecoming gig for them. It's still their biggest gig in the UK to this day.
Wow.
That whole elongated bit of Rocket, rather than being those samples, it's like really cool, like sort of jamming on the guitars and what have you. And then Joe Elliott comes in and he does all this like that. It's really good. And then he puts a little bit of A Whole Lot of Love in it, which I think is very much a nod to that middle section of Whole Lot of Love, where you just got that whole weird section in it. So it's quite interesting that Rocket's a song that bit that you're not keen on in the sort of 6.5-minute version on Hysteria. When they do it live, they either cut that bit completely and play the radio edit version, or they do something different with it when it's live and sort of stretch their sort of muscles a bit. Love Bites is the same. You often get like an extended guitar solo at the end, which is like you normally get Vivian Campbell doing that, and that's really good as well. So there are a couple of songs on that album that they often sort of flex their musical chops a little bit when they do play live.
That's cool.
And I think that's one of the things that kind of gets lost too, especially in the U.S. market, is that these guys are all really good at what they do as far as playing their instruments. I think they kind of get dismissed here as it's a pop band, and especially when you listen to it, there's a lot of Mutt Lange polish on the record. So people can't really play like that. No, they really can. They're very good at what they do, and I think to see them live, it gives you a greater appreciation for that. Just the level of musicianship and the level of show that they can put on to entertain the audience.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, well, let's get into some superlatives here, guys. Like your favorite stuff from the album. So I don't want to. I actually want to talk a little bit about the B-sides because Jackson will tell you that I'm a sucker for B-sides. I love B-sides and stuff that not everybody knows. Of course, I knew Tear It Down pretty well because they played that at the Video Music Awards. The last appearance by Steve Clark kind of on big TV was at the MTV VMAs in September, maybe 32 years ago this month. And I remember seeing them. First of all, I thought their hair was super long. I'm like, God, they've been touring so much, they haven't even had time to keep their hair. Even Phil's was a little bit long, you know. And I'm like, wow, they've really been hitting it hard. And I think they did more than 200 shows on this tour. But they had for 2+ years, and the top 20 singles kept coming. I'm like, wow, they've really played everything off the album. They've got to get into the B-sides now. It's kind of an amazing run that they could do that. But Tear It Down I thought it was going to be my favorite, but I'm not so sure it is. I mean, and obviously you did a whole show on Riding the Sun, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting because you probably couldn't have a Def Leppard B-side discussion before you get to the Hysteria album, because all of the 3 albums before Hysteria, the B-sides aren't great in terms of there's nothing particularly new there. I mean, the first album's got a song on the B-side to Hello America called Good Morning Freedom. If you ever get a chance, there's a live version of them playing Good Morning Freedom in 1980. You can get it on Spotify or any streaming version. Listen to that and listen to the drums in that, and then bear in mind Rick Allen on that is 16. So anyway, that's my recommendation. Little tangent there. But for the first 3 albums, on the whole, the B-sides are just album tracks. That's good. So the first 3 albums, the B-sides just tend to be another album track. On Hysteria, it's quite good because you get original tracks as B-sides, you get some live stuff, you get some remixes, so there's quite a variety. So Hysteria is probably the first album in which you get some interesting B-sides. Riding to the Sun was recorded as a B-side for Hysteria, very much for the fans, because Riding to the Sun is the very first song on the very first EP, which was independently put together by the band, recorded late 1978. It's actually before Rick Allen joins the band. You just got a session drummer called Frank Noon playing on that. If you were to buy, back in the day, the very first Def Leppard EP or record, then the very first song that you hear is Riding to the Sun. By the time you get to 87, then obviously Rick Allen isn't on that original recording of Riding to the Sun. And also Phil Collen isn't on that original recording to Riding to the Sun. So they re-recorded that to put Rick Allen on it and Phil Collen in it, in just a sort of like a nod to the fans in terms of, oh, this might be something you're interested in. You know, that very, very first song you would have heard of us if you were back in the day. We've re-recorded that now with what you consider the Def Leppard lineup. So that is quite a good, like, nostalgic tip of the hat. They've actually changed the lyrics on that as well. So the version on the B-side is different to the version on the EP. It's strange to think when you think of a song like Pour Some Sugar on Me, that Def Leppard would be concerned that the lyrics have got too much sexual innuendo. There's no crass on the original. I think it's lots of things like grabbing onto gear sticks and stuff like that on the original Ride to the Sun, that they actually changed it because Joe Elliott just couldn't contemplate singing the lyrics that he wrote, like as an 18-year-old, as like a 28-year-old.
Gotcha. Well, it's a great song. I mean, they do it super well. It could be my favorite. I also like I Want to Be Your Hero. I think that's a killer song. And Ring of Fire is good. And even if you get into Release Me, which is a cover, and they're having a little bit of fun with that one, but it's to have this kind of extra stuff available. I mean, it just kind of shows you, like, when Oasis did What's the Story, Morning Glory, they basically had a whole nother record of B-sides. You can see that this was an incredibly productive period for them. And then it's kind of similar with Hysteria. Yes, they had many years to kind of gather all these songs together and have Mutt hammer them out. But I would put, maybe not Release Me, but I would put any of these 4 songs on the album, and I can tell you some that I might sub off for.
Yeah, that's always an interesting thing too. Is why? Why did they include some and not include others? Because sometimes, like, you hear B-sides and you think, well, okay, that's
a B-side.
Yeah, that's not your greatest work ever. But yeah, to your point, they could have put these on the record and been, in my opinion, just as successful. So I wonder why they included some and didn't on other ones.
I think essentially what it is that, say, if you prefer Pyromania to Hysteria, which a lot of people do, especially people whose first experience of Def Leppard is Pyromania,
Right.
is that all of those B-sides sound like they could be on Pyromania, essentially, which is no bad thing. While a lot of the songs on Hysteria don't sound like they would be on Pyromania. So that's not to say that they're bad songs, but I think the way that they were judging it at the time is that, like, well, we've taken, whether you want to consider it a step forward or a step backwards, depending on how you look at it, but we've taken a different step in a different direction. And that collection of B-sides maybe sits more appropriately among what we were doing before. Interestingly, with a couple of those songs that you mentioned, then Mac. So I Want to Be Your Hero, that was originally called Love Bites, but when they recorded Love Bites and they didn't have a name for it, they just stole a name off I Want to Be Your Hero, and then they called that later on. And then also the Release Me B-side, which I don't know if you've heard the action, but essentially what it is, it's just like a joke song, and it's a cover of the song Release Me, and it's actually their tour manager who's singing on it. He's like a Welsh fella, and when they recorded it, they purposely did it like a key too high, and they joke about, like, at the end of it, it's like, you know, it was like the film Scanners, where like his head's almost about to blow up and what have you. But for some reason, when that went to in Greece, they preferred the Release Me version to Rocket. That's the song that it was on later on. I think it was on a different one in the States. So in Greece, they started playing Release Me rather than Rocket, and it went really high up in the charts, and that's the one that they were playing, and it was the joke song with the tour manager singing.
That's interesting, because I mean, we talk about Kiss a lot on this show, and just in general, the whole thing about how Beth, that was the same thing. That was kind of a jokey throwaway deal, and they flipped it over and started playing that, and that was a huge hit for them. So to your point, you really don't know what's going to sell and what's not, and if it works, go for it.
Yeah, totally.
So what is your favorite B-side, gents? I'm going to go with Ride Into the Sun. Ring of Fire is close. I think it's a really cool song. I think all four of those originals are great, to be honest with you. But
I really like Tear It Down. I think that, and I think part of it is the fact that was the last one with Steve Clark, so it kind of has a bittersweet connection for me. But I just like it, and yeah, I think Joe Elliott was talking about one time, like, imagining a rocket going up into outer space, and like as it goes up, it jettisons parts off. So, you know, maybe at that point in time they were thinking like Hysteria is the next phase, and we don't really. I mean, yeah, Pyromania was there, but we're in a new deal now. We're moving into another phase of the career or something, and maybe that's why they wanted to go take those songs and kind of push them to the B-sides. I don't know.
My favorite one would be Ring of Fire, but it's really interesting what you said about, you know, when bands have like a little purple patch where like everything they write is really good. So I think that album you were talking about, Oasis, is the master plan, isn't it? It's got like a load of B-sides on it. There's a couple of other songs that were written and recorded for the Hysteria sessions that don't feature as B-sides on Hysteria, but they feature later on in like an Odds and Sods album from 1993 called Retroactive.
Retroactive, right.
So the first two songs on that is a Desert Song and Fractured Love. Now, if you like Steve Clark, listen to Desert Song, because we were talking about earlier about Gods of War being his Led Zeppelin, a nod to Led Zeppelin. Well, listen to Desert Song and you can hear it even more keenly. And so it's not just those B-sides that show what rich vein of sort of form Def Leppard were in those writing years, and sort of between Pyromania and Hysteria. There's a few things that are completely different. Like Desert Song is like probably one of Def Leppard's heaviest songs. It's actually about, the lyrics were written after it was originally recorded, but they had it as a piece of music. So yeah, Desert Song and Fractured Love, the first two songs on Retroactive from that whole period of time as well. As is, it wasn't a big song in the States, but it was in the UK. It charted really highly. There was a song that was put on the Greatest Hits album, Vault, just called When Love and Hate Collide.
Right.
That was their last hit in the UK. And that was written during that period as well, but it wasn't finished off and completed until 7 years later. So it's not just those B-sides, there's a load of other stuff from around then that's like really good as well.
Yeah, because they were firing all cylinders. All right, well then, what's the most overrated song? Let's say, what's the song that gets more than it should from the album? Not the B-sides, just the main 12 songs. What's the one you think is overrated? Jackson, you first.
I'm going to say Love Bites. I never really liked that song because it's too slow for me. And it's, okay, you get it. Love bites, love bleeds.
You gotta have a ballad on there, man. Come on.
Yeah, that's the ballad is called Hysteria. That's the ballad to me. And I'm biased because I remember seeing when they did In the Round where Joe Elliott plays the rhythm part and Clark and Colin play the lead. That's fantastic. So yeah, that's my vote.
Right, how about you, Neil?
I don't know if overrated is the right phrase, but I would imagine certainly for yourselves, being from a state where you'd be absolutely inundated with it. But Pour Some Sugar, the familiarity of Pour Some Sugar on Me is bred up. And it's interesting with any sort of massively commercial song. You sort of got to take yourself out of that and go, well, is it actually overrated, or do I just hate it because I've been listening to it for 30 years and it's been pushed down my ears? So, to be honest, Pour Some Sugar on Me, I still love, and still is a great song, and it's definitely going to get played at my funeral, which is hopefully a good few years away, yeah. Even if it's just to annoy other people. But in terms of what song am I most likely to skip on Hysteria, or if I go and see them live, I mean, they never would not play it, but I wouldn't be bothered if they never played Pour Some Sugar because I've seen them a million times live and I know what it goes like. So I wouldn't say it's overrated, but the song that I could leave alone for a bit would be Pour Some Sugar on Me, just because it's so ubiquitous out there.
Yeah, by 1989, I would have been totally agree with you. Like, oh my God, we don't need to hear this again. Like I get it. It's big. You're a slutty girl out in the town. You want to dance to this. Like, I don't need to hear it again. For me, it's women, just because if you've got 6 top 20 hits and that's the song you put out first, that just doesn't, it's like one of these kids is not like the other, that's the one. So and I would put any of the 4, here's the thing, it's aged better. I think my first reaction in 1987 was like, this is not the Def Leppard I remember. And it doesn't hold up to the other singles. Listening to it now, it's not that bad, but I would probably put the 4 original B-sides on the record before I put that one. All right, well, what's the most underrated? Which is the one you think doesn't get enough love or should have been a single? We'll let you start, Neil.
I think there's only about 4 or 5 songs left.
Don't have any options.
12 songs on the album. Only about 4 or 5 left that aren't. To be honest, one of my underrated ones was a single, and I do think I probably would say Rocket to me is, out of all of the singles, it's probably the one that maybe didn't chart quite as high. And I think across most countries, it was one of the last. In the UK, it was certainly the last single. It was like the last throw of the dice. And so maybe by then, momentum had burnt out a little bit. And I think for me, the reason I love Rocket so much, and the reason I think that it's underrated, is that I struggle to think of any other Def Leppard song that sounds like it, and I struggle to think of any other song that sounds like it. I think in the Def Leppard catalogue, it's quite unique, and I think what they've done with it is they've managed to use the technology at the time to make something that sounds modern, that still sounds good now. So, like, say, for example, sometimes you can go beyond the technology that's available. So remember when, like, the 3 Star Wars prequels were released at the end of the 90s.
Sure.
And George Lucas was adamant on using sort of CGI.
I try to forget those.
Yeah. Yeah. And because CGI had just come about and it was in its infancy, but then he's used it way too much. And if you look at it now, it looks awful.
Right.
And because you were trying to go beyond the capacity of that technology. Well, you take CGI now, that'll still look good in 50 years because it's used within its capacity. Mm-hmm. I think Rocket does a really good job of, electronic music's been going for about sort of like 10 years, digitalization and what have you. And I think it does a really good job of using the technology and all the production values to its capacity, but not going over it. And so as such, I think it sounds like quite a timeless song to me, still to this day. Not to say it sounds contemporary, it doesn't sound like a song that could be released today, but it sort of sounds like a song that, you couldn't pin it to a particular time. And I just think it's unique and different. So I would say Rocket is the underrated one for me out of the singles.
So do you want the singles, or do you want
the song that you don't think gets enough love from whomever?
Then I'll say Gods of War, because I think it's fantastic. And the thing that I really like, I didn't know until not that long ago. So Rick Savage plays with a pick. He doesn't use his fingers. He likes a pick, and you can really hear it dig it in at the beginning of that, where he does kind of the intro bass part to that. I just love that. Even though I would say first and foremost, I love the lead guitar, a good bass jam, a nice fat groove. It's pretty cool. But to your point, Neil, the Reagan stuff, that's very dated now, but then kind of not really, because we're still messing with the same things in 2021. What? Yeah. Okay, yeah, some stuff never really goes away, but that I just think that's a cool song. It's a cool riff, and it doesn't get it kind of gets buried with the rest of the stuff on that record.
Yeah. That's really interesting that you picked that one, because I never even considered that. And I think the reason I never considered it is because we're probably coming from slightly different places, where I exist in this sort of all-consuming Def Leppard world, and like sort of obviously I speak with other like sort of like quite like hardcore Def Leppard fans, and within that community as such, Gods of War would be in everyone's top 5. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't be an underrated song. Like everyone who's like, you know, sort of like has every Def Leppard album, waits for things, would have that. But yeah, I think sort of from the more like casual fan or the wider public, then yeah, Gods of War would definitely be an underrated song.
Yeah, and I think so. I just think it didn't get the love that it deserves in the United States as far as airplay, even on rock radio. It was way down the line. So when you got to hear that it's a treat.
Yeah, I'm with you. It was my pick for most underrated, just because I think it's an amazing song. And to hear Neil talk about like that's really the Steve Clark signature song on it, I'm like, yeah, there's a reason why I like it so much. Yeah, absolutely. Quickly, we'll do favorite and least favorite. I'll go first. Favorite, as I said, is Armageddon. It. Love the harmonies, love the song, love the girls in the video. Least favorite is Excitable, song number 11. Something about it just kind of rubs me the wrong way. And I'm like, you've got these 4 great B-sides that you left off and threw away, basically, you know, to be B-sides. I'm like, and Excitable just doesn't do it for me. It kind of doesn't fit. I don't know. I'm sure to Def Lep hardcore fans, that's still a great song, and it kind of fits with the sound. It's just I thought the B-sides were better. I would have traded any of them for that one.
I mean, that song's interesting. I mean, I don't like every single Def Leppard song. I think it's mad. I mean, I know like Steve Hackett's your one. Maybe you like every Steve Hackett and Genesis Steve Hackett song. But I think most people, there'll be some that you're not so keen on. Yeah. Excitable I like, but I know a lot of Def Leppard fans don't like it. And that's an interesting song, because the idea for that song, and to be honest, there may be a breach of copyright going on without getting them into trouble, but they're opening that they sort of rip the idea off. There's a song by the Jacksons and Mick Jagger, believe it or not, called State of Shock.
Oh, sure.
And if you listen to that, I listen to the little riff in that, Excitable is very, very similar.
Interesting.
Indeed. So where that song's coming from, the muse for that song or whatever, it's from a very different place to where other songs come from. So I could understand why you wouldn't like it, because it's essentially coming from like a sort of disco
right
era almost.
A little different. Well, then what's favorite and least favorite for you on the record then, Neil?
Can I have 2 favorites?
Sure.
Okay, Love Bites for nostalgia, for just the best song, Gods of War, definitely. And then probably for the least favourite, there's a song called Don't Shoot Shotgun, which comes straight after Gods of War, which probably isn't done any favours by the fact that it comes straight after Gods of War.
Right.
You go from like the best song on the album to one of the weaker tracks. Still a good song, but I would say it's probably the weakest track on the album for me.
Jackson? Run Riot is also not my favourite. I could probably trade any of the B-sides for Run Riot, to be honest with you, but again, I think it fits. It's just not my favorite.
And it's hard for me because this has such a place in my heart, this album. But I don't know if Animal is my favorite song, but the riff at the beginning is fantastic. Just that it starts and then you get the intro part to it, and then it kind of slows down a little bit. But I think that Def Leppard as a whole is kind of underrated as far as the riffs they come up with. Like, I know you said you're sick of Pour Some Sugar on Me, but that main riff to that is just it's simple, but it's classic, and you know exactly what it is. So I really like at least the beginning to Animal. And then I would say, yeah, to me, Don't Shoot Shotgun, because it's such a letdown from, you had Gods of War, and you're like, that was all, what is this? So it could, that's a thing where I don't know if it gets an unjust demotion in my book just because it comes after such a great song.
Animal was the first single in England. Wasn't it? Weren't they going to call the album something like Animal Instinct? I mean, at first it was kind of built around Animal, isn't that right, Neil?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The album was going to be called Animal Instinct. That name did end up getting used in 87, 88. the Rolling Stone journalist. What's his name? David Frick, is it?
Frick or Fricky, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He wrote Def Leppard's official biography up until that point. So I think it takes you just up to the release of Hysteria, but at the time it's written, Hysteria hasn't been a big hit. And that book was called Animal Instinct, so it's still got some use out of the name.
Well, we're starting to run out of time here, boys. So, I mean, any final thoughts on the album overall? Or, what about 2022? Are they going to tour? Are we going to be able to see them here in the States?
They were supposed to be on a stadium tour in last year.
With Crew and Poison, right?
Yeah, so it was with Motley Crue, Poison, and Joan Jett. And that was going to be, they've done this a lot lately. They've been doing it in the States probably since about 2006, and they've started doing it in the UK as well, where they paired themselves up with other classic rock bands and bands of a similar ilk, and it's a bit of a package, almost. They've done it with Journey, for example. They've done it with Whitesnake over here. So that was going to be like one of the biggest tours years, like playing stadiums, which, they routinely haven't done. So that was cancelled last year due to COVID. It was supposed to be happening now, but it was being cancelled again. So currently they're due to play that tour next summer in the States. And there's sounds that they've during the lockdowns and what have you, that they've been writing and what have you. So they haven't announced anything yet, but they've been saying a few things which suggest that there might be a new album out. If not the end of this year, like next year, we should get a new album. Which, true to form, if it does come out in 2022, will be 7 years since their last album.
Yeah, sounds about right. Well, I mean, and maybe we need to have you on again, because I got to tell you, I think Jackson and I are in the same boat. Obviously, when Adrenalize came out, it was a big deal, right? They're back after a while. They're back after the loss of Steve Clark. We got to see them in a stadium on a big tour with a beautiful stage, and that's great. But in America, they kind of started to go away, at least from the pop culture zeitgeist anyway, and slang to me was kind of a miss. It was like they were trying to be different purposely, and I'm like, why don't you just keep being Def Leppard? I know the grunge thing happened and everyone's telling you, hey, I have to change, but it was a miss for me. And then I just kind of wrote them off, not realizing, hey, you still love all their old stuff, and they're going to get away from slang and do other good stuff eventually, right? So maybe you could help us, figure out some of their more latter-day stuff that we would enjoy.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And certainly after Adrenalize, it's a mixed bag. And any Def Leppard fan would tell you that. It's a mixed bag in terms of quality, and it's a mixed bag in terms of what sounds they go for. And it's like, if you're a Def Leppard fan, it's quite interesting to sort of see what happens after 1992. Which, weirdly, in our minds, we probably think is about 5 years ago, but it isn't. It's like 30 years ago. So it's interesting. We've talked today about, what is essentially the first, in terms of recording, the first 7 years of Def Leppard. And that's obviously what everyone knows. But yeah, since after that, there's another 30 years of story there. Which is good when you run a Def Leppard podcast.
That's for sure.
Well, it's interesting, too, because I saw them probably maybe it was 2019-ish on the Howard Stern show, and they were talking about different stuff, and somebody brought up Rick Allen, the arm. He talked about it real quick, and I think Stern said, you realize you've not had that arm way longer than you had it. And it was just kind of that stop, and everybody was like, hey, yeah, you're right. Like, you talk about it like, oh, what was that, like 5 years ago? No, that was like 40 years ago. Getting close to that, and to think you've lived most of your adult life without it, it just, to your point, these things are just very fresh in your mind, but a lot of time has passed.
This may be the biggest comeback. I mean, I kind of tend to think of Aerosmith as the biggest comeback, just because they were on top, they went all the way to the bottom, and then they came up and were bigger than they ever were. But that happened over a long period of time. They had several albums where they kind of went down and then came back up, whereas Def Leppard was just gone. We didn't hear anything from them song-wise, touring-wise. We didn't know if their drummer was going to come back or not. And music changed so much in those 5 years. And then to come back and be just the biggest rock band, certainly in the States. I mean, look, there's 5 bands in America that have 2 Diamond albums. And Diamond is 10 million sales or more, minus a greatest hits album, because the Eagles have 2, but one of them's their greatest hits album, right? And the list is pretty unbelievable. It's the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Van Halen with the first album in 1984, and then Def Leppard with these two 80s albums, and that's why they're still so huge in America. Even if they do make some missteps in the 90s, they're still able to do arenas and amphitheaters forever, basically, in America. And I'm glad that they've taken care of themselves and taken care of each other. They've gotten recognition they deserve, like Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Whatever you think about it, they deserve to be in there. And they deserve to tour and do the big shows.
Yeah, and to your point, too, the fact that they still look like rock stars, that's a full-time job. To put the dedication in to still want to do this and to have the fans show up is a testament to kind of the lasting power of definitely Pyromania and then into Hysteria, and probably at this point in time mostly Hysteria for the fans.
No, it's good because you can see that they're happier doing it now than they've ever done it before. And I suppose when you're in your 20s and success is all you've known to an extent, and you think it's going to last forever, but obviously, as you said, in the 90s. And probably through until it's only really around 2006, 2007 that they sort of start coming on an upward trajectory again. By no means did they end up in a situation where, they're playing in bowling alleys and that type of thing. But obviously, from playing like the Enorma Dome type places and everything, the popularity dives massively to playing much smaller venues. You get to a point where you don't even consider Def Leppard getting in the charts, and you haven't for years. Mm-hmm. But it comes back up again. Around 2006 in the States, it starts picking up again. In the UK, it's a couple of years later, 2008, to the point where you get to the end of 2018, where they're playing venues in the UK, like the O2 and places like that, that they've never been able to play as many nights as those places as they've had in the whole history. And it's quite good. They do these like YouTube videos now behind the scenes and everything. They're not taking it for granted. They know how lucky they are that they're still doing this after 40 years. And after going through like a rough patch, they've sort of come through it, and they're as popular in terms of people coming to see them, at least, if not record sales, as they've ever been before. And it's like, they're just taking every show as if it's the last and going, God, isn't this great? What a life.
Oh, that's great. That's a great way to wrap it up here, Neil. We've had a lot of fun here, man. That was awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'd love to do it again.
Thank you so much, Neil.
I told you I needed the script, didn't I? Thanks for inviting me on. I really, really enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Well, that wraps up show number 43 on Def Leppard's Hysteria with our special guest, Neil from Def Lep Pod. I got to tell you, me and Jackson, we had a lot of fun on this show. Neil was a great guy. He has an incredible knowledge of Def Leppard and was just a cool dude. Hopefully that came through, that not only is he a good guy, but we were really enjoying ourselves, kind of like old friends hanging out at the pub till closing time, sharing old stories. I have a feeling that it was mutual. I hope so. I hope you enjoyed yourself, Neil. And I have a feeling that we're going to cross each other's paths again here sometime in the future. So I hope that you all liked it. I hope you found some enjoyment from our deep dive on Hysteria and all the events surrounding that incredible album. It was super interesting to hear Neil's perspective as a UK Def Lep fan, because they're just not as popular here as they are in the US. This record alone sold more than 20 million copies, 12 million of them in the US, 1 million in Canada, but only about 6 or maybe 700,000 here in the UK. So if you're a UK Def Lep fan, have some pride that you found a great band from your home country that's maybe underappreciated here, but you know something that most of your compatriots don't, and there's something special, the lads from Sheffield. As usual, we want to know, did we get something right? Did we get something wrong? Did we miss the point entirely? You got to let us know. You can tweet us at @ugly_werewolf or at ActionJack72, and check out all past episodes at www.uglyamericanwerewolf.libsyn.com. And be sure to check out Neil's show at Def Lep Pod. He's got some great followers. He's got some great Def Leppard pictures and recordings on there that are great to share. And you can find both of our shows really anywhere you get your podcast, be it Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon, Podbean, anywhere you get your shows. Now, next week, we've got another very special show as live music has returned to Greater London. And I had the privilege of seeing Mr. Steve Hackett live at the London Palladium last night as I'm recording this. It was on Monday, September the 20th. Second time I've seen Steve, first time at the Palladium. And it was a great night out, a really incredible performance. So next week, Jackson is going to actually interview me, and we're going to talk about not only the performance, but the set list and all the members of the band and the Palladium, just what it's like to be back out seeing live music again, which is something I've missed dearly, and I don't think that I'm the only one out there. Trying to get through this COVID thing together, guys, and hopefully wherever you are, it's getting better and not worse, and you're going to have the opportunity to see the music that you love live here soon. So for us, to all you rock and rollers all around the world, be cool and stay safe.